The decrease in the water level in Lake Mead is mostly a human phenomenon in the sense that we're taking out more water than is flowing in.
A steel drum, rusted shut and half sunk in dried mud, sitting in the open sun on the floor of Lake Mead. Nobody dropped it there. It was dropped into deep water decades ago, and then the water walked away. That is what the new aerial footage over the reservoir actually shows, and it is not a drought statistic. It is a basin handing things back. Boats. Concrete poured to stand underwater, standing dry. A pale ring 188 feet up the canyon wall.
This landscape screams problems to me. I mean, just look at the bathtub rings. This is like a different world. We're at a tipping point.
Marking where the largest reservoir in America used to reach. And every object out there surfaced for the same reason, written down in 1922. A line that no one drew. The band on the canyon walls is mineral stain, nothing more. Calcium carbonate left behind by water that stood against the rock for decades, bleaching red-brown stone to something closer to bone. No artist painted it, no engineer specified it, and no map records it. It runs dead level for miles because water runs dead level, tracing the old surface of the reservoir around every cove and inlet with a precision no surveyor could match. From a boat today, a person has to tilt their head back to find the top of it. That gap between the current surface and the stain is not weathering and it is not decoration. It is a measurement and it is a ledger entry cut into stone. Roughly 188 feet, the height of a 17-story building stacked from the waterline to the mark, is the exact distance the largest reservoir in the country has lost. What the recent aerial passes do that a single photograph cannot is show the whole basin in one continuous move. The camera crosses the stain, drops into the exposed flats, and keeps going, and the scale stops being abstract. Coves that held 40 feet of water are pale dust. Islands are hills. A channel that boats crossed without noticing is a dry ravine. None of this happened in a single hot summer. The ring came back into daylight 1 foot at a time, over more than 2 decades, and the ground it uncovered did not stay empty. A retreating shoreline is not just an absence, it is a delivery. Subscribe before the inventory starts, because what the mud handed back gets stranger with every foot the water drops. What the mud handed back. The first things to appear were boats. Lake Mead has been a recreation area since the 1930s, and for as long as people have taken boats out onto it, boats have gone down on it, hulls that filled and slipped under, while their owners swam for shore. In deep water, a sunken cabin cruiser vanishes and stops being anyone's problem. 40 years later, the water walks away, and the problem is sitting in the open, cracked apart by sun. Fiberglass gone chalky. Some of what surfaced was older than pleasure craft. In 2022, as the shoreline pulled back, a landing craft of the type built in enormous numbers during the Second World War came up out of the mud near Hemingway Harbor. It had been resting in something like 185 feet of water. Park Service staff knew roughly where it was, and divers had visited it. Then the lake fell far enough that no diving was required, and a piece of 1940s military hardware sat beached in the Mojave, half in air, half in silt. Then there is the infrastructure, and nobody lost any of it. Every piece was placed deliberately, at depth, by people who assumed the depth was permanent. Concrete intake structures designed to draw water from well below the surface now stand fully exposed, dry from base to crown, with nothing around them but baked sediment. The Southern Nevada Water Authority spent years and roughly $1 billion boring a new low-level intake and pumping station beneath the lake bed precisely because the older ones were being stranded. That project was not a precaution, it was a rescue. The retreat has also rearranged the living lake, not just the dead one. Somewhere on this shoreline, this summer, a crew is moving a boat ramp downhill for the 3rd time. They survey the new waterline, cut a channel through the exposed grade, pour or lay another apron of asphalt out toward water that has already started to leave again, then set the cones and the closure signs when the drop outruns the pour. Marinas that once floated over deep water have been towed section by section, extended on longer cables, or shut down entirely. Launch sites that appeared on maps a decade ago now end a long walk short of the waterline, their concrete finishing in gravel and cracked mud. The low water hazards that used to be a diver's curiosity, submerged. Pilings, old roadbeds, drowned rock are now a propeller's problem, and the people who mark them are marking a target that moves every month. And scattered through the flats are the barrels. Steel drums rusted through in places, some upright, some tilted at odd angles, lids crusted shut by decades of pressure and sediment. Most of what has been recovered from them is mundane. Construction debris, sludge, ordinary industrial trash from an era when sinking a drum in a reservoir was a reasonable way to make it go away. No single object out there is a mystery. Boats sink. Contractors dump. Intakes get built where the water is. The only mystery is that the water level fell far enough for long enough to put all of them in the same photograph at the same time. Then, in the summer of 2022, one of those barrels turned out not to be construction debris. The town that came back up. Before there was a lake here, there were places, ranches, rail sidings, and one actual town, which people had to be paid to abandon. St. Thomas, Nevada, was settled by Mormon pioneers in 1865 near the confluence of the Muddy and Virgin Rivers. By the 1920s, it was a real place with a real main street. There was a school and a post office. There was an ice cream parlor, which in a valley that hot was less an indulgence than a public service. There were orchards and fields watered off the rivers, and something in the range of a couple of hundred residents who expected their children to be buried in the same ground as their parents. Then Hoover Dam went up downstream, and the government came with maps and explained that the water backing up behind it would arrive at roughly the height of their living rooms. Residents were bought out, some willingly and some not. Buildings were burned or dismantled for salvage. Fruit trees were cut. The last holdout was a man named Hugh Lord, and the story that has followed him for almost 90 years is that in June 1938, he rode away from his own house with the reservoir coming in the door behind him, the town he had refused to leave going under in the same slow week. It stayed under for the next 60-odd years. It came back up in 2002 when the decline that began around the turn of the millennium first exposed the town site, and it has been dry land ever since, long enough that the National Park Service now maintains a hiking loop through it. In 2026, a visitor can park, walk in over cracked ground, and stand between the same concrete foundations, cisterns, and low walls, reading interpretive signs in full sun, in a place where for 6 decades the only way to see any of it would have been a tank, a dive light, and a very good reason. This is not a bad season. It is a reversal deep enough that a town drowned in 1938 has been out of the water for the better part of a quarter century, and the retreat has kept going past it. The town site is proof, in poured concrete, that a waterline people treated as permanent was a temporary condition, and the cause of that reversal is not the weather of the last few summers. It is a figure written into a document at a lodge outside Santa Fe in November 1922, and that figure is still law. The number written at Bishop's Lodge. On November 24, 1922, representatives of 7 states signed an agreement at Bishop's Lodge in the hills above Santa Fe, New Mexico. Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Presiding was Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce, 6 years from the presidency and at that moment a referee. The fight he was refereeing was dangerous. California, downstream and growing fast, had already built canal capacity to pull enormous volumes out of the river to irrigate the Imperial Valley. Under the doctrine that governed water across the West, prior appropriation, whoever put water to beneficial use first held the senior claim more or less forever. Every acre California watered was an acre of future claim the upstream states might never touch, which turned growth into a race they were losing. Arizona's governor at one point raised the prospect of state militia at the river's edge to defend what he considered Arizona's rights, men with rifles on a riverbank over water. The Colorado River Compact was, in its bones, a peace treaty, and judged on that ambition it worked. The states signed, the river was divided into an upper basin and a lower basin, and the West got on with building an empire in a desert. But to divide a river, the negotiators first had to know how large it was. The engineers gathered the gauge records they had, principally flow measurements taken between roughly 1899 and 1921, ran the averages, and arrived at a figure that would shape the next century. The Colorado, they concluded, carried something in the range of 16 to 17.5 million acre-feet a year. An acre-foot covers 1 acre of ground to a depth of 1 foot, very roughly a year's supply for 2 or 3 households. Millions of them sounded like abundance. On the strength of that number, they wrote the allocations, generous shares to each basin, plus later obligations to Mexico, all resting on one estimate. The estimate was taken during the wettest stretch the basin had seen in centuries. 2 decades of gauge readings was the best record in existence at the time, and the science that would later expose the problem did not yet exist. Tree ring reconstructions assembled decades later, which read growth rings as a proxy for stream flow going back more than 1,000 years, put the river's long-run average closer to 13 to 14.5 million acre-feet, and in many years, lower. The men at Bishop's Lodge had weighed the pie at the single moment it was fullest and then promised slices against that weight. Some engineers of that era looked at the short window and said so, warning that a longer record would likely show drier averages. Those cautions were set aside because the larger number let every delegation go home with more. The result is not a rounding error. It is a structural overpromise on the order of several million acre-feet every year, water that was allocated, guaranteed, and built upon, and that in most years does not arrive. If the arithmetic was wrong in 1922, why did it take until the 2000s to show up on the canyon wall? 70 years of borrowed time. The answer is the lake itself. Hoover Dam was completed in 1936, more than 700 feet of concrete wedged into the throat of Black Canyon. The river pooled behind it and kept pooling, drowning side canyons and washes until Lake Mead was the largest reservoir in the country by capacity, on the order of 28 million acre-feet when brimming. That reservoir was never only a tank, it was a buffer, a margin of error made of water. A river does not deliver the same volume twice. Some years the melt comes down fat and brown. Other years the snowpack is thin and the river arrives quiet. Left to itself, that swing would have made the modern Southwest unlivable. The reservoir smoothed it. In wet years, Mead filled above what the states drew, banking the surplus. In dry years, the states drew the bank down, taking more than the river brought, so that no city and no farm felt the pinch. It absorbed the overallocation along with the swing, because the wet years arrived often enough to refill what the dry years and the overpromising drained. So the arrangement held for close to 70 years, and almost nobody interrogated it. Cities and irrigation districts grew into the margin, millions of lives were built on banked water, and the ring on the canyon wall was invisible because it was underwater. In 1983, after a run of very wet years, Lake Mead reached its high mark, the surface climbing to nearly 1,225 feet. Standing on the dam that summer, a person could have concluded that the desert had been beaten and the promise made in Santa Fe had been kept. It had not been kept. It had been postponed, and a buffer only postpones while the deposits keep pace with the withdrawals. Starting around the year 2000, they stopped. Snowpack in the Rockies came in thinner. Warmer temperatures meant more of it, sublimated or evaporated before reaching the river, and more of what melted soaked into parched soil instead of running downhill. Flows fell, not catastrophically in any one year, but relentlessly. One modest disappointment stacked on the last. The pale ring rose back into the daylight a little more each summer, like a tide going out and never quite returning. For a while, it was reasonable to call that a dry spell, the sort of thing the reservoir existed to ride out. Then, researchers comparing the period against the tree ring record reached a heavier conclusion. By several measures, this has been the driest stretch the Southwest has endured in more than 1,200 years. Not drought, which implies a temporary departure from normal, mega drought. In 2021, the Bureau of Reclamation declared the first official shortage in the history of the Colorado River system, triggering mandatory cuts. The buffer was gone, and the shortfall the lake had quietly absorbed since 1936 now had to be paid out loud by someone. The rules for choosing that someone were written generations ago. The order of who loses. When the compact and the agreements that followed carved up the river, they did not merely divide water. They ranked it. They set an order of who is served first when there is plenty, and, more consequentially, who is cut first when there is not. At the bottom of that order sits Arizona. Arizona did not get there by accident or by waste. It got there by trade. When the Central Arizona Project was authorized to carry Colorado River water hundreds of miles across the desert to Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona accepted junior priority in exchange for the canal it badly wanted. It agreed that if a day came when there was not enough, it would step back first. That day came. Central Arizona farmers growing cotton, alfalfa, and grain on land their families had worked for generations, watched allocations shrink and in some districts vanish, with groundwater and fallowed fields as the fallback. Several hundred miles west, other fields stayed green. The Imperial Irrigation District in southeastern California holds some of the oldest and most senior rights on the entire river, claims that predate the 1922 Compact and Rest, on the same first-in-time principle that governed the West long before anyone met at Bishop's Lodge. When the cuts cascade down the priority ladder, Imperial is largely untouched. That is not the same as Imperial doing nothing. The district has signed conservation and fallowing agreements that leave water in Lake Mead in exchange for federal payments, and its senior rights are the legal bedrock its regional economy was financed on. Rights that can be erased by a bad hydrology year are not rights. Still, the priority system explains why the popular villains are the wrong ones. Picture the crisis, and most people picture the strip's fountains, golf courses, sprinklers hissing over stucco subdivisions at dawn. Those things are real, but Nevada holds the smallest allocation of any basin state and recycles nearly all the water it uses indoors, returning it to the lake. The water is not in the fountains. Roughly 70 to 80% of Colorado River water goes to agriculture, and a striking share of that grows a single category of crop, alfalfa and other cattle feed. Follow one bale. It is cut in a field outside Blythe or Yuma, ground that yields 3 or 4 cuttings a year only because a canal arrives, and every pound of it is water that came out of the river and will not go back. It is baled, trucked to a compression plant, pressed into a block dense enough to ship, loaded into a container, hauled down the interstate to Long Beach, and eaten by a dairy cow in Asia or the Gulf. Alfalfa is a rotation staple. It can be fallowed in a dry year more easily than an orchard, and it underwrites a beef and dairy supply that consumers buy. It is also, physically, water in the shape of dried grass, leaving the basin by sea. The lake gave up its depth so that cattle elsewhere could eat, and no fountain in Nevada moves that number, which is why the problem is stubborn. Fixing it means renegotiating century-old law, unwinding promises entire economies were financed against, and deciding who surrenders water that was never really there. That renegotiation is happening now, and the clock on it runs out this year. The rules that expire. The compact set the shares. It never said what to do when the river came in short, which for the first 70 years was a question the reservoir answered on everyone's behalf. The rules for shortage are newer. In 2007, the basin states and the federal government adopted interim guidelines that put the answer on paper. They tied Lake Mead's elevation to defined shortage tiers, so that a specific surface level triggered specific cuts, and they operated Lake Powell and Lake Mead as a single system, moving water between the two to keep both above critical thresholds. They also let users bank conserved water in the lake, rather than lose the right by not using it, the first serious attempt to make conservation legally rational. The 2007 rules assumed a river that no longer existed. By 2019, the states bolted on a drought contingency plan, layering further voluntary and mandatory contributions onto the tiers, with Mexico participating through a parallel agreement on the treaty side. The reservoirs kept falling anyway, and by 2022, federal officials were openly discussing whether Powell and Mead could hold enough head to generate power at all. States were asked to volunteer reductions and told what would happen if the volunteering fell short. All of it was interim, and the interim ends now. The 2007 guidelines, the drought plan, and the near-term adjustments adopted in 2024 run through 2026, which is why the negotiation over what replaces them has been running for years. The upper basin states argue they cannot guarantee fixed deliveries out of a snowpack they do not control, and that cuts should track actual hydrology. The lower basin states, which take the largest share and hold the most senior rights, want defined, predictable reductions they can plan and finance around. 30 federally recognized tribes hold rights across the basin, many of them senior and some still unquantified, and were not at the table in 1922. Mexico's share sits under a treaty, not the compact. If the states cannot agree, the federal government can act. The Interior Secretary functions as watermaster of the lower river and can impose operating terms on Lake Mead, and Reclamation has said it will do so, rather than let the system fall to levels that threaten deliveries. Almost everyone involved expects imposed terms to end in litigation, potentially at the Supreme Court, which has settled Colorado River disputes before and took years doing it. So, the shoreline that keeps giving things back is also the surface the negotiation is scored against. Every foot it drops changes which tier applies and which state pays. And while the lawyers worked, the retreat kept uncovering things nobody had prepared for. What the water was keeping. Since the steep decline began, more than one set of human remains has emerged along the exposed shore of Lake Mead, on ground that had been underwater for decades. They were not found by any search. They were found because the water left. On May 1st, 2022, near the Hemingway Harbor boat launch outside Boulder City, someone walking the newly dry bed came across a corroded steel drum lying in the mud. Inside were human remains. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police determined the man had died of a gunshot wound and said he had most likely been placed there decades earlier, when the water at that spot would have been deep enough to swallow a barrel whole and hold it. Investigators publicly estimated the period as somewhere in the mid-1970s to early 1980s, based in part on personal effects recovered with him. 6 days later, on May 7th, a second set of remains was found by sisters paddleboarding near Colville Bay. Additional discoveries followed at other exposed locations in the months and years after. Not all of them are connected to one another. Some are consistent with drowning deaths in a recreation area that has seen many over 90 years. That distinction matters because the temptation with a story like this is to fold every discovery into a single narrative, and the evidence does not support that. The barrel does carry an unmistakable echo of the city 40 minutes away, and of the years when the desert around the neon was rumored to keep things quiet for people who could not afford to have them kept any other way. But that echo is the least important thing about it. The important thing is quieter. Somewhere there was almost certainly a family who never learned what happened to that man. Someone who left and did not come back, whose absence became a question that was asked, then asked less, then stopped being asked aloud. The lake held him for something like half a century. Then it could no longer hold what it held, and it gave him back, not out of justice, but out of thirst. As of the last public updates, the case remains open. Some of the other remains recovered along the shoreline have never been publicly identified. Each one is a question the water was keeping until the water got too shallow to keep it. And the water is projected to keep going. Reclamation studies put Lake Mead in the low 1020s or below within the next couple of years under probable conditions. Every foot of that is new ground. The honest number. So the footage is not a curse and it is not an omen. It is a statement of account. The ring is the river being made to say its honest number after a century of being asked to pretend otherwise, and every foot of it is a receipt. Good years still. Buy time. A strong Rocky Mountain snowpack lifts the surface, boats float over the wreckage again, and the stain goes back under. It does not change what was signed in 1922. It does not change who is first in line. And upstream, behind another great dam, Lake Powell is telling a version of the same story that may prove harder to face. So, here is the question worth arguing about. Knowing that the great majority of this water goes to agriculture, and that the oldest rights are the last to be cut. If the hard choices finally have to be made, who do you think should give up their water first? And who should be protected? Tell me below. And if you want the upstream half of this story, subscribe, because Lake Powell is next.